billiards, competitive billiards. Is there men's and women's billiards, or do men and women compete on the same playing field in billiards?
I do not know the answer to that. My guess would be same playing field, but I don't know.
Yeah, that would be my guess too, but I'm not 100% sure of that.
Zach's
I'm not
nailed it
even
for us.
I'm not even 60% sure of that.
Billiards competitions, male versus female, something like that.
And I also want to add an odd exception. Maybe it's one of several, but American football, right? There is no women's American football, right? There's men's and women's soccer, interestingly. I would guess rugby is like football and that there's no women's rugby. No. There's college level women's rugby, I think. But anyway, it is interesting that...
Well, and then you have baseball and softball, right? Like women's baseball, I mean, certainly some women play baseball sometimes, but I don't think that there's professional women's baseball. If you're playing that kind of a game as a woman professionally, you're playing softball, and men also play softball,
right?
But women don't also play baseball, I think.
Right. Now I don't think I ever saw a league of their own, but am I right that women were playing baseball during the war?
I thought it was softball, but I don't remember.
Well, in any case, there's an interesting landscape here. Why don't we have women's football? Why is the logic of soccer not the same logic as American football? There's a question about whether or not, so if men play at a higher level in sports that physical prowess is the question, then it's interesting that women's sports work. And I want to point out why I think they do. But if you...
What do you mean what they work? What does work mean?
If the top men are... If no woman can compete with the top men in a sport, like let's say tennis, then the question is, why, if people are going to see the top tennis players, does women's tennis make sense? And the answer...
So you're talking about as a spectator sport, not as a sport. As a sport, there's question.
Right. No, I am talking about...
You're talking about the spectation.
Yes, I'm talking about why it makes sense that we have, a men's and women's division at Wimbledon, for example. And I think the answer...
Expectation is not a word, incidentally.
What?
That's the word I used, expectation.
Expectation. I like it. Well, you can be very persuasive. So,
precisely.
Yeah. So I guess my point would be, one of the things about, what is a sport? A sport is a physical game in which the obstacles faced by the competing parties are the same. Right? So you can't play soccer on a slanted field. Or if you do, then the point is each side spends
half... You can play soccer in a V-shaped field in which the goals are at the end.
Yeah. A little bit like Ulama, the Central American ball game. But...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, with the slanted sides. But anyway, put that aside for a second. The game neutralizes...
Now extinct. Like Aztec, I think, or Toltec or something.
I believe it was actually passed down. The Olmec, the Toltec, the Aztecs all played Ulama. And Ulama still exists. It's just such a hard game that it's not... When
it's played now, though, it doesn't end in human sacrifice? Or?
No, not of either the winners or the losers, which I understand different cultures did it differently.
Yeah.
But this is a game in which there's a tiny little hoop, like a basketball hoop, but it's up on edge. And the ball, I think, can only be passed around and launched with the hip. It's a very crazy game. But anyway, the point is, top women competing with each other is not inherently a much worse game than the top men pitted against each other, because they're even with each other. And so anyway, the point is... If you're
interested in physical skill and prowess, if you're only interested in, speed and force, then the women's sport is not going to give you as much of that as watching men's sport. But in general, sport is not just about, sheer, speed and force, right? It's about skill and frankly, and this is, as I have said before, back when we were playing a lot of Ultimate, I played on the University of Michigan women's team for a bit, and then we played a lot of summer league and captained co-ed teams and also went to some day-long tournaments and such and watched a lot of men's games, played in a certain number of women's games and played way, way, way more co-ed games and captain co-ed teams. And by far for me, now obviously I never played on a men's game, but by far the most interesting of those was the co-ed games, because men left to their own devices on the field were much more likely to just like huck it long. One guy runs down, maybe he gets to lay out, and it's awesome for those two guys, and it's pretty great for the other, depending if it's a full, thing, other 5 people. Is it 5? It's been a while. 7, yeah, right? 7 people on a team?
Don't recall.
Oh, goodness.
It's been that long.
Yeah. The other people on the team, but the points are short, and it's, to the victor go the spoils sort of thing. And by contrast, the women's only games are much more likely to involve very short passes, much more cautious, less risky, short passes. It takes forever to go down the field. The person who does want to huck it long or run and dive into the end zone is much less likely to have the opportunity. And there's also much more of a focus, and this will come as a surprise to no one probably in our audience, even if you have no idea what ultimate frisbee is that in women's only games and on women's only teams, there's much more of a focus on like, let's make sure everyone gets to handle the disc, let's make sure that everyone ends up getting to play. Like, actually, this is competition here. That's not supposed to be one of the main things. And so you have these these slightly too much, like almost caricatures of maleness and femaleness in an all-male game of Ultimate and an all-female game of Ultimate. And because this is not supposed to be a contact sport, and it really does work as a co-ed game, and usually 5-2, 5 men, 2 women, 4 men, 3 women, something like that, and you got to be matched up pretty well. You actually reduce some of the silliness of the extreme all-male and all-female exigencies when you're playing together.
Right.
And it's fantastic.
But it is neutralized structurally as part of the game. Ultimate is a strange game because it actually builds into the structure of the game inclusiveness and fairness. The game actually has the rules written in that if somebody doesn't understand a rule, play stops and the rules explain and all that. So anyway, the point is, structurally, in Ultimate, right, you wouldn't pick teams and have an uneven number. You wouldn't have, the preponderance of women on one team. That would be an unfair game. There is a tendency to balance the number of women on each side, and there is a tendency for players, not necessarily by sex, but players to match up with a player of similar skill and speed, so that one person is not fully shutting down the other person. So the point is the game...
And if you don't have that, then you do a different kind of defense. You don't do a man-on defense. You do a zone defense or something. Because if you don't really have roughly... and this is more in a strictly competitive situation, right? Okay, are we out here? Are we doing pickup to have fun or to brutalize the other team? And the other team, we're going to swap it up in 15 minutes. And some of you people who I was just trying to brutalize are going to be on my team. Like, yes, I'm on a team right now and I want to win this point because that's fun. And that's kind of why I'm out here. But I'm also not interested in let's line up with you who I know I can take and outrun. And then the point's going to be over really fast.
Yeah.
It's not interesting.
Not interesting. Right. Yeah. Well, anyway, look, I think the really interesting one here is the acting one. And your question is a great one about why the acting...
Before we go back to acting, though, because I actually, you kind of predicted one of the other places I wanted to go, and maybe we'll end on acting. I actually found in the Seattle Times a couple weeks ago, January 22nd, there's an article called, headlined, "Renowned Hawaii Surf Contest, the Eddy, Plans Return After 7 Years." And I don't surf. I've never watched a surfing contest. I don't know very much about it, despite having grown up in Los Angeles. But one of the things that they say in here in this article, and I have failed to mark where it is that for the first time, I believe, ever, they're inviting women to compete. So this is not going to be the Eddy, and maybe this has already happened at this point. I think this has been long enough. For the first time, it's not going to be just a male-only competition. And I thought, okay. So we have as the reasons that I had come up with for why there need to be categories by, under what conditions there should be categories by sex. in those situations where men and women are just fundamentally different enough that combining the sex categories would mean that women wouldn't get to play, basically. There is the historical reason for like, oh, we're going to right some wrong, and so make sure that women get voice here. And then there's this is about human versus nature. And so I looked into how it is that surfing contests are judged, and it's a little figure skating-y, right? So there's a lot, like it's judges, and the top and the bottom scores are mostly dropped, and I'm sure it's different in different competitions. But they're assessing on a number of things, like how many maneuvers they use, and how obviously if they wipe out, that's not good. But there are measures of like, apparent power, apparent strength, apparent fluidity on the wave, which is going to give an advantage to male surfers. But if a competition is on a particular day at a particular break, and apologies, I'm probably not using exactly the right words here, but there will be different waves that happen at 10 a.m. versus 2 p.m., of course. But if it's your turn to go out, part of what you're being assessed on is like, which wave did you choose? And the waves are the waves. Then it's human against nature, which is remarkable. And in this case, like, well, men may have a little bit of an advantage, but really, like, what are you going to do? If you're going to call surfing a sport, and this gets back to the question of like, what is a sport? If you're going to call surfing a sport, just like if you're going to call figure skating a sport, you're going to have to introduce some social means by which you're assessing. Whereas if it's it's ulama in Mesoamerica, or ultimate frisbee, or American football, or what everyone else calls football in the rest of the world, soccer, where there are formal rules. It's there are dimensions and specificities around the court or the field, and the size or shape and density of the ball or the disc or whatever it is, and how it is that you score and what the conditions are. Then you can control everything. And it's a little bit like human versus nature, but controlled. It's like we've domesticated war. It's domesticated war at some level and been like, okay, now let's play at this.
It's a laboratory sport in the sense that the laboratory purges all of the extraneous influences as much as possible so that you can see the effect. And a tennis court is similar to this. Yes. Whereas, it's like the difference between gymnastics in the Olympic sense and parkour, which makes use of things that are non-standard. Yes. But I did want to...
you wanted to go back to acting.
Well, before that, I wanted to point out that there are two male-female asymmetries that could result in the need for a female category in sport. Mm-hmm. One of them might have to do with the fact that males have an advantage because the sport depends on strength and things like that. And my guess would be this is somewhat relevant to surfing, but mm-hmm. There's a question about if you scaled the board down so that it was the same ratio of person to board. Maybe it's not. On the other hand,
I don't know.
On the other hand, to the extent that something is highly competitive, it might be that if you didn't have separate male and female categories and you were looking at elite players, mm-hmm. that women would not get there because a much smaller pool of them would ever have tried the sport. And so the point is the tails of the distribution that show up would be much smaller, and so the number of people who would be able to do it at an elite level, having nothing inherent to do with their capacity, just having to do with the fact that the competitive modality would tend to census more widely amongst men.
Well, as you know, I don't buy this line that is very common in the psychological and other literature that women aren't as competitive as men. I think it's total crap.
Yeah, but I'm not.
But men and women compete differently. It manifests differently.
I think you're reading something into my point that's not there, because my point is in the athletic modality, you would have had fewer women attempt this. And so we wouldn't find that many who had that elite capacity. So I agree with you. Yes, women are equally competitive and it's different, but the sporting modality leans in the direction of men.
Yeah. I think it would depend on the sport, but that's interesting. It's a different selection bias. It's a selection bias about choice in advance. And this, this is related to some of the correctives that people are trying to put into place, not in sport, but in things like, equity in, software engineers, the sex ratio of software engineers. Whereas once, equity has been achieved and actually like flown past, and now you have more women in, say, medical school than men. Apparently, I saw this recently. No one is saying, oh wait, like maybe we should slow this down. If what we were seeking was equity, which is to say, and I don't think we should be, but if what we were seeking was that, then it's supposed to match the sex ratio of the population. Then we got a problem. We do have a problem. We got too many of our institutions favoring sort of female style of learning and making their way through the world, such that increasingly a lot of really, really great men are like, not for me. This is not doing anything for my brain. I'm not going to be able to manifest myself here, so I'm going to go do something else. And that's bad news, and we don't see that very much being recognized.
Yeah, we don't. It's arguable that it's correcting a long-standing wrong, and that's why they don't respond. I think it's nonsense, but it's possible.